Hey everyone, welcome back. This is one of a series of short videos addressing questions in foreign economic policy. In this video, we're going to look at the use of sanctions as a tool of foreign policy. In general, economic sanctions are commercial or financial penalties applied by states or institutions against states, groups, or individuals which attempt to coerce an actor into changing its behavior by disrupting economic exchanges. In other words, sanctions can be intended to compel, attempt to change an actor's behavior, or to deter, an attempt to stop an actor from engaging in certain actions. Sanctions can target an entire country, being comprehensive or general in their focus, or they may be more narrowly targeted at individuals or groups. This latter form of sanction is sometimes referred to as smart sanctions. The impact of sanctions depends on the economic power of the country or countries imposing them. In general, the more powerful the economy of the country imposing sanctions, the more impactful the sanctions will be. Not surprisingly then, the United States has attempted to use sanctions in a variety of cases to compel or deter particular actions by other countries. Indeed, the United States is responsible for about 2/3 of the global use of sanctions since the 1990s. Currently, the United States has economic sanctions imposed on 6 countries, including Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Syria, Russia, and Venezuela. And it has targeted sanctions imposed against the leaders, political, and economic elite of some 20 other countries, including not just the 6 previously mentioned, but also countries including Afghanistan, China, Eritrea, Iraq, Lebanon, Myanmar, Somalia, Yemen, and many others. These sanctions take a variety of forms and have different goals. The U.S. embargo on Cuba, for example, was first imposed in 1958 following the Cuban Revolution. The sanctions are broad, impacting nearly every aspect of the island's economy, and have the goal of forcing regime change in Cuba, as well as punishing the island's leadership for the country's human rights record. These sanctions are unilateral in nature, and the United Nations has regularly condemned and called for the U.S. to end the sanctions. They're not supported by U.S. allies. The U.S. embargo on North Korea is similarly broad in scope. First imposed in 1950 but expanded on dramatically over time, the sanctions on North Korea affect nearly every aspect of the country's economy. Like the embargo on Cuba, the sanctions on North Korea were originally intended to foster regime change and to protest the country's human rights record. But over time, the sanctions have increasingly focused on limiting the development of North Korea's nuclear weapons program. And unlike the Cuban sanctions, the sanctions on North Korea are broadly supported by U.S. allies and the United Nations. Throughout much of the 1990s, Iran was subject to strict U.S. sanctions. Citing the country's poor human rights record and its support for Hezbollah, Hamas, and other U.S.-designated terrorist organizations, as well as for its nuclear weapons program, the sanctions target Iran's oil and natural gas exports, its financial sector, and its global arms trade. These sanctions have been widely supported not just by traditional U.S. allies, but by the UN Security Council as well. Beginning during the reign of Robert Mugabe and continuing through today, the United States has imposed more targeted sanctions against government officials in Zimbabwe. Supported by key U.S. allies, the sanctions freeze financial assets and prohibit travel for persons the U.S. accuses of undermining democratic processes and institutions in the country. And finally, following the military coup in Myanmar, the United States and other Western countries imposed an arms embargo on the country, prohibiting the sale or transfer of weapons to Myanmar. It also imposed financial sanctions and travel bans on persons associated with the military government. From these examples, we can already get a sense of the variety of goals sanctions are used to pursue. They're often employed to signal a message of disapproval because they can be opposed at relatively lower costs when compared to the use of force, but carry greater weight than a simple diplomatic statement. Sanctions are often used to send a clear message to a country that its actions are viewed as unacceptable by another country. When successful, sanctions may also influence the behavior of targeted countries, entities, or individuals. By imposing economic, political, or diplomatic pressure, sanctions aim to create leverage and compel other countries to change their policies, cease objectionable behavior, or comply with international norms and standards. Sanctions can also serve as a deterrent by signaling potential consequences for specific actions or policies. The threat of sanctions may discourage other states from engaging in similar behavior as they observe the economic and political costs faced by targets. And when that deterrence fails, sanctions can be used as a form of punishment or retaliation against countries or entities that have engaged in actions deemed unacceptable by the imposing country or by the international community. By imposing economic hardship, restricting access to resources, or isolating targeted actors diplomatically, sanctions can impose a variety of costs for violating international norms. In this way, sanctions contribute to the enforcement of international norms and standards, imposing consequences for violations of international law or norms, and particularly when widely adopted and supported by the international community, demonstrating a commitment to upholding shared values, principles, and the rule of law. And when implemented through international organizations like the United Nations, sanctions can enhance their effectiveness, amplify the message, and demonstrate the unity of the international community in addressing specific challenges. In this way, sanctions foster multilateral cooperation and build coalitions to address common concerns. And as we've already alluded, the sanctions themselves can take a variety of forms. We tend to think of economic sanctions as being something like a trade embargo, which restricts trade with another country. In fact, sanctions take a variety of forms. States may impose import restrictions prohibiting the importation of goods from certain countries. These are often targeted at a particular industry, like the UN embargo on Iraqi oil sales in the 1990s, which limited Iraq's ability to sell oil on global markets. Conversely, export restrictions prohibit the exportation of goods to a certain country. These often focus on sensitive technologies that may be used for military purposes, for example, limiting North Korea's access to technologies that might be used to support its nuclear weapons development. More recently, the US embargo on the semiconductor chips to Cuba provides another example. Arms embargo are a specific kind of export restriction, prohibiting the sale or transfer of weapons to a specific country. Financial sanctions are often used to target the assets of individuals and entities associated with a country. This can include freezing assets, preventing individuals from accessing banking or financial services, or blacklisting companies from doing business in certain countries. Because of its central position in the global economy, and in particular the central role played by the US dollar, the United States has often made extensive use of financial sanctions, an example of weaponized interdependence that we explore in another video. Indeed, in recent years, financial sanctions have been the favored form of sanctions by the United States, as they tend to focus the pain of the sanctions more narrowly than trade embargoes or other kinds of broader sanctions. Finally, travel bans and visa restrictions are often used to prevent travel by designated individuals seeking to isolate them from the international community. The primary government agency responsible for administering sanctions in the United States is the Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC. Based in the Department of Treasury, the OFAC is responsible for issuing licenses and exemptions to sanctions, as well as for enforcing sanctions compliance. The OFAC has lead responsibility for the U.S. sanctioned regimes on Cuba, Iran, Sudan, and North Korea, and has some responsibility for the sanctions on Syria. It oversees the designation of individuals targeted for sanctions by the U.S. government. But there are other actors involved. The State Department is responsible for developing and coordinating U.S. foreign policy, including sanctions policy, and administers the secondary sanctions program against Iran. It also has responsibility for approving arms exports. The Department of Commerce is responsible for enforcing export controls and has primary responsibility for overseeing the sanctions on Syria. The Department of Justice is responsible for investigating and prosecuting violations of sanction law. And in some cases, the Federal Reserve and the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency may also be involved in sanction regimes, particularly involving access to US dollars. US sanctions can apply to key individuals, often political, military, and economic elite in particular countries. These people are referred to as specially designated individuals, or SDNs. Examples here include the sanctions imposed against individuals in Zimbabwe or Myanmar that we just discussed. Sanctions can also be imposed on entire countries, like the US sanctions on Cuba and North Korea. And finally, sanctions are sometimes imposed on particular products or activities. Here, examples might include the restrictions imposed on the trade in blood diamonds. While sanctions can take a variety of forms and can be enacted in pursuit of a variety of goals, there are several factors that influence the effectiveness of sanctions regimes. Generally, sanctions are going to be more effective when their objectives are clearly defined, realistic, and well-targeted. And by contrast, Ambiguous or overly broad goals can hinder the focus and effectiveness of sanctions. Sanctions targeting broad or dynamic transformations across a country, for example, the sanctions imposed to foster regime change, are less likely to be successful than more narrowly targeted sanctions seeking less dramatic changes. Sanctions that target individuals, entities, or sectors are often more effective than broad-based measures. Pinpointed targeting minimizes the unintended consequences and broader negative social and humanitarian impacts of sanctions while maximizing the impact of sanctions on the intended targets. The resilience and adaptability of the targeted country or sector is a crucial factor. Sanctions are more effective when imposed on countries heavily reliant on international trade, investment, or access to global financial systems. For example, sanctions which target a country's oil exports will be more effective against a country that's heavily dependent on oil than against countries that have well-diversified economies. Similarly, the economic power and vulnerability of the country imposing the sanctions matters. In general, larger and more powerful economies like the United States or the European Union are better positioned to impose sanctions than smaller countries or smaller economies might be. And because the imposition of sanctions often carries a cost on the imposing country as well, the political will and support for sanctions in the imposing country matters. A good example of this might be the sanctions imposed by the European Union on Russian oil exports in 2021. The sanctions had a dramatic impact not just on Russia's exports, but on the economy of the European Union as well. The effectiveness of sanctions thus depended on the willingness of European citizens to bear the cost of those sanctions in terms of higher energy export prices and oil prices until they could find alternative suppliers to set in and offset the loss of Russian oil imports resulting from the sanctions. One of the most important factors in determining the success of sanctions might be the degree of support for sanctions at the global level. Sanctions backed by broad coalitions of countries and international organizations are more likely to be effective than unilaterally imposed sanctions. Multilateral sanctions demonstrate the unified international opposition and increase the economic and political pressure on the targeted country while simultaneously cutting off potential alternative markets or sources of support through which the sanctioned country might be able to evade the impact of the sanctions. In other words, the level of compliance and enforcement of sanctions is vital to their effectiveness. If there are loopholes or weak enforcement mechanisms, targeted entities may be able to find ways to evade or circumvent the sanctions, either through trade with non-sanctioning countries or through access to illicit markets and trade networks. The duration and severity of sanctions increase their effectiveness. Longer-term sanctions can increase the economic pressure and potential cost on the targeted country, but they also increase the cost on the country or countries imposing the sanctions and have a greater chance of causing unintended humanitarian consequences in the impacted country. Several studies point to the importance of ongoing diplomatic and political engagement, as combining sanctions with diplomatic negotiations can increase their effectiveness. A comprehensive approach that combines pressure with opportunities for dialogue and negotiation, in other words, can increase the chances of achieving the desired outcomes. And finally, because sanctions can have a variety of unintended consequences such as humanitarian suffering, strengthening authoritarian regimes, or triggering political and social destabilization, finding ways to mitigate potential consequences is critical to the success of any sanctions regime. Those unintended consequences are one of the major criticisms of sanctions. Sanctions can have dramatic negative humanitarian impacts on the civilian population of affected countries, particularly when sanctions are broad in scope. Economic sanctions can lead to shortages of essential goods, including food, medicine, and basic necessities, affecting vulnerable populations and potentially violating their human rights. These impacts are often felt unequally across society. In many cases, the political and economic elite can take steps to protect themselves from the negative impact of sanctions, leaving vulnerable populations to suffer their impacts and exacerbating pre-existing social and economic disparities within the targeted country. Sanctions can also have other unintended consequences that undermine their intended goals. They may strengthen authoritarian regimes by allowing the leaders to rally their population against the external pressures or the enemy, and they may result in the creation of informal markets or illicit networks that benefit criminal networks. Sanctions can also strain regional stability and lead to political and social destabilization when their effects spill over into neighboring countries. And as we've previously considered, sanctions also have unintended economic costs on the imposing country. Businesses and industries in the sanctioning country may suffer due to restricted trade or lost economic opportunities, and sanctions may strain diplomatic relations with countries that have economic ties to the targeted country, leading to potential trade conflicts or retaliation. This is particularly true in the case of so-called secondary sanctions, which are essentially sanctions imposed on third-party states for violating sanctions imposed against another country. This sounds more complicated than it actually is, and an example may help clarify this. Remember that sanctions work by targeting domestic entities with penalties for violating the sanctions. For example, in 2021, when the United States imposed sanctions on Russia over the war in Ukraine, it closed its markets to Russian exports and threatened American businesses with penalties if they attempted to trade or do business with Russia. These are usually referred to as primary sanctions. In theory, the United States lacked the power to force other countries to abide by the sanctions it imposed, and businesses in third-party states were free to continue to trade with Russia. But such trade undermines the effectiveness of the US sanctions, as we've previously discussed. And so, to increase the impact of the sanctions, the United States threatened to impose secondary sanctions as well. These sanctions threaten to cut off access to US markets for businesses from other countries that engaged in trade with Russia. In other words, the United States would penalize the foreign governments and businesses for violating the US embargo by cutting off access to the US market, effectively forcing them to choose between trading with Russia or trading with the United States, or perhaps more importantly, by forcing them to choose between accessing the Russian or US financial sectors. Indeed, secondary sanctions are often enforced by threats of cutting off access to US financial markets, banks, and dollars to parties that violate them. These are called secondary sanctions because they target parties that are not immediately party to the dispute, and not surprisingly, such secondary sanctions are highly unpopular with US trading partners because they essentially compel them into participation in a sanctions regime that they may not otherwise support. Sanctions are also sometimes criticized when they lack a clear exit strategy or off-ramp for targeted countries to restore relations and achieve policy changes. This can lead to prolonged stalemates or perpetuate a cycle of hostility without providing a path forwards towards resolution or reconciliation. Critics often point to the US embargo on Cuba as an example of this problem. Critics often argue that sanctions also fail to achieve their desired objectives or outcomes. Targeted countries may find ways to circumvent or mitigate the impact of sanctions, such as by relying on alternative trading partners, establishing parallel financial systems, or engaging in illicit activities. And sanctions may fail to bring about the desired policy changes or behavioral modifications as a result. And when they are used, sanctions are often used selectively, with some countries being targeted while others are not, while engaging in similar kinds of behavior. This can lead to accusations of hypocrisy and double standards. And finally, critics argue that sanctions constitute a form of economic warfare that can be used to punish or coerce other countries. This can damage relationships between countries and make it difficult to resolve disputes peacefully. But despite these criticisms, sanctions remain a popular tool of foreign policy, particularly for US policymakers. That's it for now. Please leave any questions you have in the comments section below, and thanks for watching. Bye.